Hello friends, YouTubers and motorcycle enthusiasts. This is Accelerate coming at you once again with a new video. It's been a few months since I put anything out, but I am back, and it's great to be back on two wheels again. As always, on my trusty Yamaha FZ09, which I think the more I ride this bike, the more I love it. So this thing is an absolute dream. Love riding this thing. My standard first gear wheelie. I try not to do wheelies anymore, really, on the street. For those of you that know me, I try to brisk but calm, right? That's the goal. Safe, but still having fun, keeping it safe. So I wanted to make this video with my time off. I've actually had a little bit of a revelation with my search for a dual sport motorcycle. So, like my previous videos, I believe I posted it, but either way, I'm considering getting a dual sport motorcycle. The world of dual sporting's really piqued my interest, and I'm very excited to get into dual sporting, being able to ride on and off road, and to enjoy all the things that come with dual sport motorcycle riding. However, of course, whenever you get into anything, you always have to make a decision, right? You start looking at the field, looking at what's available, and seeing what is worth putting down your hard-earned money for. And I won't go too far into it. I have another video that I'm going to put together about the whole gambit of dual sports. Your options as of 2018. For those that looking to get in anything, as we know, but manufacturers always try to lay out the options of what to go for with this personal specific preference per person. So one thing that has come to my attention is the reignition of a company called SWM. That's let me see if I get it right. It's Speedy Works Motorcycling, Motoring. That's it. Speedy Works Motoring. And I've messed it up almost every time now, but you'd think after reading about it so much that I'd have it right. But nonetheless, most of you have probably never heard of SWM. I know that I hadn't, unless maybe you were riding motorcycles and enduros in the late 70s and early 80s, which SWM produced motorcycles then out of Italy. However, in the 80s they went under. The financial crisis that come with a lot of companies in the 80s, they were no more. However, a little bit of history on it, just so I can talk about SWM, who they are, just a little bit of a background. So, as I mentioned, they were around back in the day, and KTM bought Husqvarna essentially in 2014. I want to say it's 2014. Forgive me if I don't have that date, that year rather, exactly correct. But when KTM bought Husqvarna, they quit making the Husqvarnas in Italy, and then of course KTM's out of Austria, where they moved all the production of Husqvarna to Austria, where the KTM bikes are produced. So with that in mind, there was this entire factory that was essentially left with all the tooling left standing for availability. And what ended up happening is some engineers that worked for Husqvarna at the time of the buyout opted to go searching for investors to reignite SWM. And they did it. So they had a Chinese investor, Shinery Auto Group, I believe it is, come through. They invested back into SWM. They bought the factory, and they started producing motorcycles, which are very, very similar, thus it being a Husqvarna factory, very, very similar to the Husqvarnas. And if you look at the SWM line, you'll see that they almost mimic the line of the Husqvarnas, where you have the 690, the 501s, the 300s, so on and so forth, for what they offer in the Enduro or Dual Sport line. So they did that, and they've been producing motorcycles, I want to say, since about 2015 released the 2016 models, I want to say. So they're relatively new, but they are also Husqvarna sourced. So very, very similar to Husqvarna. They changed a few things about them, of course, being their own brand. And they're also having to pass modern, 2016 and above emissions. So there's all that goes along with it as well. So with that in mind, SWM makes two bikes specifically that I'm interested in. The SWM 500 RS, RS 500R, which obviously is 500cc dual sport motorcycle, and then the 300, the RS 300R. And they do make a enduro dual sport version as well as a supermoto. I have no interest in a supermoto at this time, just because of the White Lightning, the FZ09. I have a street bike. I don't really have a need or a want for that. What I want is the ability to go off-road and have fun, and on and off-road capability, ride to some trails, ride to some maybe an ATV park or whatever, get dirty, play around, and then ride back. So that's my prerogative with the dual sport. So the beauty of SWM, because they are sourced from Husqvarnas, specifically the 500 is what I'm looking at, and I've been doing as much research as possible between the 300 and the 500 to kind of get a feel for what I may want. The beauty of these motorcycles is they fall right in a range that there is a gap, and that gap being the difference between the KTM Husqvarnas of 2018, which run anywhere from $10,000 to $11,000, give or take dealer pricing and things like that in the US. And then the other end of the spectrum is the Japanese dual sport motorcycles that are substantially cheaper. Brand new, you're talking anywhere from a 250, we'll say KLX 250, which is like $5,000, $5,500, all the way up to WR250R and a DRZ 400. Those are my bikes of interest, which are around $6,500. MSRPs and all that. Again, deals varying. So the SWM, given whenever they actually hit the U.S. import, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute, the 500s are going to land around $8,000. So it's kind of in the middle. Appropriately so, because also not only is the pricing in the middle, but the performance is in the middle as well. And whenever I say performance, I'm not just talking about power, but suspension, overall anonymities for motorcycles and things like that. The newest technology that goes into that stuff. So obviously at the very forefront, your KTMs, your Husqvarnas, your Betas, they are race-inspired enduro bikes. That's their bag. That's what they do. So, with that, whenever you have a single-cylinder, single-piston engine that's making 60, high 50, 60 horsepower out of a 500cc bike, a la the KTM 500EXC, your maintenance intervals are much, much shorter. These are race-bred machines. So your valve adjustments or checks and adjustments, your oil changes, they're all measured in hours as opposed to miles. So, you know, that's something to take into consideration other than the hefty cost. You know, I'm not looking into primarily dirt riding. I'm not looking into getting into enduro racing or anything like that. So, you know, for me, that's definitely the high end of the spectrum of where I would want to go. And I've looked at them. I've looked at used ones and even the new bikes. Now, with the Japanese side of the house, you know, these bikes are much cheaper. The quality's still great. A lot of these bikes are Swiss Army knives. You know, they're very durable. They are less expensive, but they also make way less power. And with that power comes lower maintenance. So, you know, their service intervals are, you're talking, a perfect example for the WR250R valve check is 26,000 miles. 26,000 mile valve check. You know, your oil changes are like standard motorcycles, you know, when ridden normally on the street. Easily, you know, 3,000 mile oil change with quality oil. So, you know, it's choose your poison, right? The SWM is, as I mentioned before, in the middle with, towards the middle with cost, also towards the middle with power. You know, the 500EXC makes around 50 horsepower, and you know, I converted that. They post it in kilowatts, being a Italian manufacturer. You know, it's about 50 horsepower, so it's not at the bleeding edge with the modern Husqvarnas and KTMs, but it's also substantially more than the other two bikes of interest, the DRZ 400 and the WR250R, where they're, you know, modified. You know, you're talking mid-20s to mid-30s tops, and the WR being, of course, less, just because it is a 250, where the DRZ is a 400. So the SWM, also in the suspension category, has really good suspension. Also has Brembo brakes. You know, it's a step above. It's a step above where the Japanese manufacturers currently are. And you know, a lot of the Japanese bikes have not been updated for many years. For example, the DRZ 400 debuted in 2000, I believe it is, and the bike has changed almost none since 2000. So, you know, that's not saying it's a bad bike. It's just, you know, it's really good at what it does, and what it does is just being a dual sport, you know, motorcycle. So, you know, there's that to think about as well. Now, another thing with SWM, you know, I talked about the cost, the power, but the maintenance intervals also. The maintenance intervals on the SWM is also in that mid-range. It's not, you know, quite the you know, change the oil and forget about it type of bike, or at least for quite a while, that the Japanese bikes are. But at the same time, it's not as high on the spectrum as the KTMs and Husqvarnas, just because it's not making as much power. They are dialed down in that regard. So, you know, what SWM says and what they're really targeting is a performance trail bike. You know, they're not looking for people that are going to, you know, move from the big two and move towards SWM to try to take over that scene. What they are trying to do is fit it in to where the Japanese bikes aren't quite enough for some people in performance, but they're also, you know, more than, you know, they're not quite the KTM Husqvarna, but they're right there in the middle. So fantastic. Now, I mentioned earlier that SWM had an investor, a Chinese bike manufacturer. These guys produce tons of stuff like scooters, mopeds, and all that stuff. A very large company. So, you know, the initial fear when SWM first hit the scenes, and it was kind of what some of my first questions was, is it made in China? You know, are they Chinese bikes? You know, are they going to have Chinese engines, so on and so forth? And they don't. They are manufactured solely in Italy. Every piece of the drivetrain is the frame and the drivetrain is tooled, manufactured, and assembled in Italy. So that's pretty awesome. Now, where they are saving power, of course, being that $2,000 to $3,000 under the KTM's and Husqvarna's, is number one, they're not using top of the line race inspired stuff, just because of the market target that they're going for. And the second piece is that they are not producing the, every piece of the bike is not Italian. The parts of the bike that are from China are some of the things like the plastics, not primary components of the motorcycle. It's where they're saving money, because let's be real, you're not going to be able to produce, there's always, it doesn't matter what manufacturer, they're always going to weigh the costs of what it costs to make the bike with how much they're going to sell it for in the target market. So they had to save money somewhere, and things like the plastics, some of the parts that bolt on the frame, they're able to save money in that area. So I've read a lot of reviews on the SWMs of the people that have owned them and that are currently riding them, and they have nothing but great things to say about them. Great bikes from the overall consensus, very reliable. That they are Italian made. So with that in mind, I'm looking very, very close at an SWM. So the thing about an $8,000 price tag is, it's easy to get lulled into I guess you could say the idea that it's cheaper. When let's be honest, my FZ09 was $8,200. That's what I got it at with the dealer that I work with. And to pay $8,000 for a dual sport motorcycle is not cheap in its own right. That's $8,000 is not nothing for me personally to shake a stick at. But it's not a KTM Husqvarna prices, and the performance from what it looks on paper and the reviews that I've seen is substantially better than the bikes of Japan. And I'm well aware that, I probably don't need a ton of power off-road. Most people say that. I haven't ridden dirt bikes since I was young. I have ridden dirt bikes a lot when I was younger, but I haven't, as an adult, I just haven't owned or ridden dirt bikes or dual sport bikes off-road for that matter. So, power is not a huge deal, which is why a lot of people like the WR250R so much. And at the same token, it's more than just power, right? So I'm about 215 pounds. I fluctuate maybe 10 pounds. I fluctuate a little bit given the season. But nonetheless, I'm not a small guy, right? I'm not 160, 170, 140 pounds, or whatever the case may be. So with these bikes, suspension is a big deal. Whenever you start talking about, whenever you buy a bike, how good, the question that you always have to ask is, how good is this bike out of the box? Which is part of the reason why I chose the FZ09. This bike is fantastic out of the box. I don't need to do a lot of stuff to it. With the 2017, they added the adjustable suspension, and those were selling points to me that I said, okay, I'm not going to have to replace put new different springs in it, or change the shocks, or change the rear shock or the front forks, or I'm not going to have to tweak it because it's going to suck on the road. And it doesn't. It's fantastic. Once I adjusted the suspension to me, then even from the dealer, they tweaked it a little bit. It's perfect. The same is true for me whenever I'm looking at a dual sport. And a lot of people, what's some of the first things they do to these dual sports out of Japan? Some of the first things they do is bolt on exhausts, start modding the airbox and start either jetting the carb or doing power commander, depending if it's carburetor or fuel injected. Because they want more power, and a lot of times the Japanese dual sports at this time, they don't deliver. They don't have a lot of power for what they are. Another thing that they do is a big one is people modify the suspension, especially if you're taking a dual sport motorcycle, which is really designed to be a little bit more plush on the road with its suspension, and taking it off-road and I should take that road off-road in hard terrain, and the suspension, they're just too plush. They're not up to the task. And as you get a heavier rider with gear, with anything else that you're going to be doing, if you're adventure riding or something like that, you have other stuff that you're carrying with you, the stock suspension just doesn't cut it. So, of course, people end up dumping more money into their bike because it wasn't up to the task out of the box. So, that $6,500 price tag of a WR250R, I mean, you're talking $1,500 difference. $1,500. I can spend $1,500 on a motorcycle in no time. I mean, whenever most of your exhaust systems and your mods that people do are $500-$600, and everything adds up. All these modifications are going to add up quickly, and then before you know it, you've got $1,500 into a bike, and it's really not better than what you could have spent when what you could have had whenever you spent the initial money. So anyways, I'm kind of rambling at this point, but I'm trying to look at all angles across the spectrum, of whenever I get into this dual sport, like I said, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. I've got a little Kirby. Whenever I do finally get a dual sport motorcycle, I want to make sure that I'm getting the right bike, because I'm older now. I keep my bikes. I want to get the right bike and hold on to it. Anytime you switch up, doesn't matter what it is, whether it's motorcycles, cars, whatever the case may be, a lot of times you're going to end up losing money, and that's really not something I want to do at this point. I want to buy the right bike for the first time. That way, I can just ride them and enjoy them, because that's what I want to do. Just get out here and stay on two wheels and keep enjoying it. So anyways, guys, well, that's all I really have. If you guys have any input on SWM, and if you have any personal experience with SWM, or that you've ridden one, or whatever the case may be, then just leave a comment in the section below. I like the discussion. I like to hear more input. So I hope you guys have a fantastic week, and get out there, get on two wheels, and have fun. This is Accelerate, signing off.